Good morning, everyone. The subject of farm organisations has obviously already percolated through the discussions this morning and last night, and it is a pretty important one, and it will be followed by a more focused discussion tomorrow that will report the AFI's recent research. You'll notice from this slide that I have a co-author. Let me tell you about the co-author. He was going to present on this session as well until he got a better offer, and keen observers of the Wallabies England football match last weekend might have seen him hobnobbing with Prince Harry. I didn't actually see the game, but anyway, that's why he's in England in his capacity as the President or Chairman of the Australian Rugby Union, and he sends his apologies. Now, in addition to the slides that I'm going to talk to, I've prepared a sort of a more discursive paper, which is copies will be outside if anyone is interested. Between us, David and I and a few fellow travellers have gone to a bit of trouble to document some of the history of farm representation in Australia, the current situation and the future, and it seemed worthwhile to have something as a bit more of a standing record. So, in terms of the scope of this presentation, it is a little bit, if you like, NFF, past, present and future. The only comment I'd make on that slide is that when I come to some commenting on a few current NFF activities, David Crombie, as a former president and recent former president of NFF, said that it was not appropriate for him to reflect on what's going on there currently. So those views are mine. I'll skip over them in this presentation, but there's a bit more detail in the paper itself. And as far as the final point there is concerned, in essence, we believe that the present structural and funding model of NFF, regrettably, is broken, and it needs to be discarded and start again. So what I say in the lead up to that will try and set the scene for the sort of proposition that we're going to talk about. So July 1979 was the formation of NFF. It was the Holy Grail. Unity had been talked about forever. We were dealing with these scurrilous politicians who had the ability, as all farmers knew, to divide and conquer, to say that, well, because you guys can't come and put a single proposition to the government, then we might not need to make a decision on it. So, and then also in the 70s, farmers, agriculture generally, was under a lot of pressure economically. We'd had the collapse of the wool industry, wool prices. We'd had oil shocks, we'd had high inflation, we'd had excessive wages growth and what have you. And so the pressure was on financially, both on farmers and on their organisations. So trying to reduce some of the duplication that existed was part of the motivation, but fundamentally it was more involved around policies. And John hinted at this too, that over time, the issue that had divided farmers historically, and here we're talking mainly about the mixed farming community of wool and meat and livestock, was marketing. In essence, statutory marketing on the one hand versus free markets on the other. That was what got people passionate, and those who are of longer tooth, like myself, can remember an organisation called the Australian Wool Industry Conference. The parliament of the conference was comprised of 50 people, 50 wool growers, 25 sat on either side, and the division down the middle was about 5 miles wide. So it was they were fairly contested times, but gradually farmers realised that all of that was relatively secondary to the issues that bore on agriculture generally and farming businesses, the broad economic issues. And again, John has mentioned them this morning, and they were quoted from John Ralph's comments last night. Macroeconomic policy, taxation, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, wages policy, tariffs, and so on. And farmers decided that on those issues they could all speak with one voice, so heck, why shouldn't they? And then we had a couple of particular issues that happened, and one of them was the live sheep export dispute in 1978 that you might remember involved pickets and a meat union campaign trying to set a ratio for the numbers of sheep that could be exported live relative to carcass exports. An understandable perhaps, but in fact a totally misguided view about how to improve job prospects in abattoirs. When they inserted pickets on the wharves in South Australia and stopped the export of live sheep, that galvanised farmers like never before. And planes of them flew in from Queensland and so on, and they bussed in from everywhere else. And the net result was that that picket and that union campaign was defeated, and the goodwill that it was generated from that whole episode really meant that the subsequent amalgamation at the state level and the formation of the National Farmers Federation became really a doddle. So NFF was formed. It was a federation of state farmer organisations and commodity councils. At that time, there was no really serious consideration given to direct farmer membership of a national body. There had been, as my paper describes, a direct farmer model in the past, in the 40s, but it was always a poor relation and it folded up in the late 60s. The other interesting part of history was that as well as the quest for unity, there's always been splinter groups. We had a group in the 70s called RAM, Rural Action Movement. That was just general dissatisfaction from poor economic circumstances and a hope that someone might, quote, do something about it. We had a more celebrated split in the cattle industry in Queensland that led to the formation of the Cattlemen's Union. So all of these things were going on together, but ultimately farmers were hoping that that they would get to a point where they had one organisation that could speak with one voice. Reference to the first farm organisations, the late 19th century, they started off because of industrial relations battles. There was a shearers' strike in Queensland, and the wharfies tried to put in an embargo on the export of wool that was shorn by non-union shearers. And they lost that battle, and they've lost quite a few battles, other industrial battles over the years. Since the time that NFF formed, a lot of things in agriculture have remained the same. Volatility of seasons and markets, the export focus of agriculture and a whole lot of other aspects. Scale has gradually been improving. The average age of farmers has always been high and still is. Farmers have been affected by high off-farm costs and low off-farm productivity. They're all issues that have more or less remained unchanged. But there's a wide agenda of items that has been different since 1979-80. First of all, in the structure of agriculture, of course, massive relative decline in the wool industry, once the preeminent enterprise in agriculture. Horticulture's been up. The dairy industry reconstruction that John talked about, and I would certainly echo in terms of his comments about Pat Rowley. 80% fewer dairy farmers now than there were when I started my professional career, producing probably double the amount of milk. So you can see the extent of the changes that have happened. We've had the communications and IT revolution, which has done some wonderful things in terms of GPS navigation for farm machinery and farmers' ability to get information through the internet and in many respects overcome the tyranny of distance. But equally, all of that has made for a much more cluttered space for information, and again John made some reference to that too. Many of the policy areas now settled. Again, I'm talking about the marketing debate on the one hand versus macroeconomic policies on the other. Not everyone is totally in lockstep on some of those. You do find references to a desire to return to single desk marketing for wheat, for example, and the idyllic hamlet of Rankin Springs was mentioned before morning tea. 3 of my mother's brothers were soldier settlers at Rankin Springs after the First World War, so I know it well. Jock Munro, however, is not a relation. But in essence, that debate is over. And meanwhile, we've had all of the new issues that are on the agenda now that really, at the beginning of NFF, just weren't there. The other issue, and it's been referred to, I mean, the interesting thing, Mick, is how many of these issues have already come up in various ways, but the emergence of groups that are overtly hostile to agriculture or to the activities of farmers in one form or another. One of the other issues that still probably got some further, and hopefully got some further momentum to work through, is the increased recognition of women's role in policy development and, of course, in farm businesses themselves. That's been, in the past, you'd have to say, a fairly shameful part of agriculture's history. We have been a very blokey industry that doesn't reflect well on us, but it's starting to be redressed. Another fact of life is that farmers, like everyone else, are time poor. Very few of us have time to go to a farm conference that extends over 5 days, or to spend a 15-year apprenticeship in farm organisations until they finally get the tap on the shoulder to join the executive committee, and so on. So we come to the present, and I think it's useful to pose the ultimate question, and that is, do we need farm organisations at all? Are they now obsolete? Have they done their work? Is it the fact that farmers just don't care about them, so why not just close them down? I think we ought to be clear about the principles of what the organisation should and should not do, and in essence it's all part of what in policy terms is described as the market failure logic, and that is that the organisation should do the things that farmers individually can't, or where there is a benefit from clout of numbers. And it's interesting that in the terms of reference for the current recently appointed Commission of Audit, those words are virtually expressed there very nicely, I'm pleased to say, by the government. Whether they follow through in implementation is another thing, but the role of government should be there to do things that people on their own can't, and no further. I'd like to acknowledge one of NFF's most valuable adjuncts or legacies, if you like, and that is the creation of the Farmers Fighting Fund. It came out of the live sheep export dispute, it came out of the Mudgeonbury abattoir dispute, where farmers and others, and particularly others from the business community, put money into this fund so that it would be able to be set aside to be used in particular instances that could not be anticipated in annual budgets. The numbers, the dollars, were never disclosed, appropriately not, but it was known that if there was an issue where the fighting fund became involved in, funds would be adequate to the task, even if it involved quite extensive litigation. In my view, its continued existence is one of the great aspects of NFF's existence. So my conclusion is that as numbers of farmers fall, and as therefore the direct influence of farmers declines, as they say, the number of votes west of the sandstone curtain these days is very small, and you heard John's figures in the electorate of Gwydir itself. It's harder to get the message across directly. So weight of arguments has got to supplant weight of numbers. Let me come a bit to some of the present aspects. NFF, as I did a little bit of brushing up and scraping of rust off, has got a couple of documents that is guiding it at the moment. One is a strategic plan, which is more of an annual focus, and then secondly it's formed this blueprint document which has got a longer term focus. I admit to being a paid up sceptic of a lot of these sorts of documents. And I am a paid-up sceptic because I think the wrong people get to hold the pen. They have become increasingly the preserve of PR consultants or management consultants or bureaucrats, dare I say it. And this is a criticism not just of NFF, but you read any government report these days on any subject, and the language is almost impenetrable. In the paper, I've mentioned all of the weasel words. There are missions, there are goals, there are visions, there are strategies, there's stakeholder engagement, there's needs analysis, there's shared understandings. I mean, it's all there, and in my view, 90% of it is hollow. Farmers don't speak like that, farmers don't think like that, and the next document that NFF produces, and I'm looking at Matt Liniger because he's just commissioned it, let's have none of that sort of language, and let's have it really quick to the point on what's going to happen and how. Now, Matt and I have discussed this, and he says, well, behind all of that, there's a lot more still going on, and I take the point. But I think these documents have got to be effective in themselves, and the question to ask is, do they, of themselves, convince an individual farmer to join up one of the organisations? And I'd say it would be hard to be convinced of that. So here's a quick Crombie and Trebeck perspective on how this might be guided. Actually, largely Crombie's words. It takes a page to write this out in the paper. First of all, some principles, simple to understand, focus on a few big issues, have it underpinned by good data and rigorous analysis, use arguments that are fair, not extreme, capture the attention of politicians via the community, and for the individual member be perceived as valuable so that they're going to pay for it. So that's the starting point. And then from there on, here are those few big issues. Again, it's been talked about in the session this morning and in last night. Demand for high quality. I mean, we talk about, are we competing on price? Are we price takers? Should we be value adding more? These are questions that have already been asked. I think one thing that we can say is that we know that the middle class in China don't want milk with melamine in it, and they don't want fruit and vegetables that's riddled with E. coli. And they're the sorts of opportunities that as a high quality, reliable producer Australia's still got to offer. As far as the community is concerned, my judgment would be that by and large, even though the direct connections with people in the city and people in the country is much less now than it used to be, by and large the people in the city still like farmers. They think farmers work pretty hard. They think they're honest toilers, and that's not a patronising type of comment. That's a respectful comment. They're not quite sure whether they can trust farmers with water or the environment, so that's where more has to be done to improve that trust. But enhancing that trust and working on that trust is absolutely vital, and it's one of the problems where some of these social media focused anti-agriculture groups are starting to make inroads, and it represents, I think, the way to combat them. So back to the farm organisation specifically, there's no doubt member numbers right across the board are falling, and not just because there are fewer farmers now than there used to. The best farmers, as an assertion I would make, the best farmers don't appear to be engaged often. And why is this? Obviously, it's because they think they've got better things to do with their time and their money, and that's got to be a real concern to us. It is hard to convince people to join up at the individual level, and I'm sure Fiona understands this. And one of the reasons is that we are talking about a classic example of the free rider problem. If I'm a non-member of New South Wales farmers and I get approached to put in $200 or $500, and I'll say, oh well, what I do won't affect how effective the organisation is, and that's true. But if 1,000 people take that view, then it does make a difference. The net result is that the budget at NFF is being formed by a bit the lowest common denominator, by the problems of the weakest organisations, and that wasn't the intent early on, and is being squeezed. And then we'll have the discussion tomorrow about the AFI research, which will be very interesting. Let's, consistent with the theme of not beating up on ourselves too much, let's understand that agriculture is not the only part of the economy that's facing these problems. Trade unions certainly are, more so in the private sector trade union area. Business organisations are. But agriculture doesn't need to fail just because all of those fail. In fact, we should be succeeding. So over the years, there's been a number of attempts to review and refine and change the structure. As far back as 2001, NFF recognised the existing structure wasn't working. It was working at the start because all the state farm organisations were strong financially and had good levels of membership. So the voting structure and the funding structure that was set up at that time could work for that reason. But when it started to fall away, and particularly fall away in some states more quickly than others, then it started to incur problems. So the committee that was formed at that time came up with the Australian Farmers Proposal of an individually based membership organisation. I'll come back to that. It was supported by a number of state and commodity organisations, but ultimately vetoed by a state organisation not too far away from this room, and so it didn't progress. The next attempt a few years ago led to the involvement of associate members from the agribusiness sector into NFF, and I'm quite happy to say that as part of my board commitments, I was very strongly supportive of both Primag through the Corporate Ag Group, joining as an associate member of NFF, and also at GrainCorp, getting GrainCorp to join. And I don't know how many sort of corporate lunches I've been to over the last 3 or 4 years where various agribusiness people have been grizzling like hell at the fact that agriculture is not, the voice is not being heard enough. And so, well, here's one way that it could be. But it's been disappointing, I'd have to say, at how few have actually joined up in that capacity. There are a number of agribusiness organisations. I was Googling 3 of them over the last couple of weeks. There's an agribusiness council that was formed a year or so ago and immediately got into a massive spat, I think, between the chairman and the CEO, and has never gone anywhere. That was an outcome of a Senate inquiry, for goodness sake. There's an agribusiness association, which is a bit more people-focused, been around for a while, got very low profile. And the Food and Grocery Council has recently formed an agribusiness forum. And I just have to say that none of those have had any traction substantively or in any other way, except they do tend to distract from time and financially, and that's not helpful. As part of the preparation for this talk, I did a fair bit of Googling on the website of the American Farm Bureau. I've known about it for a long time. I've never actually been to it and so on, but it is impressive organisation with a capital I. It's a single membership at the national level organisation, but there are affiliates in every state. There are 2.2 million farms in America, and there are over 6 million members of the Farm Bureau. Why? Because, as one quote said, it's not a bureau, and it doesn't only talk about farms. Gardeners, food and wine enthusiasts, anyone who shares the interests and goals of farmers can become members. There's even a thing that says, if you eat and drink, you've got an interest in agriculture, so join up, and people do. And then the real clincher is that the membership subs are held at a low level, and tied to it are a whole raft of commercial opportunities that that allow an individual member to more than recoup the cost of membership. General Motors, $500 off a vehicle, plus another 1,000 at the moment as a short-term incentive through to April 2014. I presume General Motors sales are not going too well. 20% off accommodation from a major hotel chain, 30% off pharmaceutical and veterinary drugs, only savings available to members. Well, if we could replicate that type of situation here, I think we'd really be cooking. What if we could get all of the four-wheel drive owners around the country, especially the millions in the cities driven by mothers taking their kids to school, because it was economic for them to buy tyres and batteries through this? Or every person who goes to the Deniliquin Ute Muster a year who's a member, or the Henty Field Days, and so it goes on. The opportunities are actually pretty enticing when you think about it. And my colleague and assistant in this paper, Ian McLaughlin, said, yes, let's go for the grey nomads. We can add a bit of romance there because they can get the big hat that they've never had before. So you do a deal with a Cobra as part of it. Anyway, so that's part of the future as I see it. So I think we've got an elephant in the room very much. I think it's been there for more than a decade, and it is now increasingly squeezing the life out of the structure and the operations of our farm organisations, and that is the federated structure. And when I make this criticism, I don't walk away from a minute from the fact that I was part of the amalgamation committee that helped write the NFF constitutions and all that went with it. So that might have been fine then, but I don't think it is now. We've got blurred messages. I don't want to single out New South Wales farmers, so I'll say Victorian Farmers Federation. If they are talking about, as they have to their members, what they've achieved for their members, it often is to the exclusion of some of the things that are done at the national level. It gets particularly frustrating when the NFF is stated by a state organisation as being part of them rather than part of us. So instead, we now would advocate that we go back to the sort of Australian farmers model that was developed by the committee that had Peter Corish on it, among others, back in the early years of the previous decade. An integrated national farmer organisation operating under a single brand. There's a bit of detail in the paper about how it would be structured. It's, again, largely as it was advocated at the time. It obviously poses a big challenge to the existing state farm organisations because, let's not shy away from it, it's a challenge to their power and authority and maybe some committee involvement and status that's there. But I think we've reached the point now that the state farm organisations have lost so much, and this is a general statement, applies differentially between states, but they've lost so much in terms of financial authority and membership strength that their opposition can't be allowed to deter this sort of change. I imagine that might be a debated issue later on. Advantages of all of this, well, there they are. That was again spelt out in the document a decade ago. Common branding, better utilisation of skills, administrative savings, better way of supporting the weaker states or the weaker organisations, and of course opportunities for commercial deals that really have been allowed to atrophy over the state farm organisation buying services over the last decade or two. We think that the case for this change is more compelling now than it was a decade ago. In fact, we think time's running out. We think the alternative of trying to stay with the existing system is just going to be a continuing slide. Less work, fewer staff, pay constraints on staff that make it harder to get or retain the best people, fewer members and so on. But all the while, our problem is not that we lack dynamic young entrepreneurial farmers and their supporters. They're everywhere. It's just that we've got to get a better value proposition to engage them. So On that basis, and with the discussion that's to follow tomorrow and the results of the NFF review recently commissioned, I look forward to having all of this turn around dramatically over the next year or two. Thank you.